Jennifer Park sits in the glass-walled conference room on the 23rd floor, watching her colleagues file in for the Monday morning strategy meeting, and she feels that familiar tightness in her chest that she has learned to recognize as her body's early warning system, the instinctive response that something is wrong even before her conscious mind has assembled the evidence. She has been with Vertex Technologies for 8 months now, brought in as the new Director of Product Innovation, with great fanfare and promises of transforming the company's approach to development. And on paper, everything looks successful. Her projects are on schedule. Her team produces quality work. Her presentations to leadership are well received. But there is something underneath the surface that she cannot quite name, a current of resistance or hostility that manifests not in open conflict, but in 1,000 tiny gestures and omissions that individually mean nothing but collectively create an unmistakable pattern. As people take their seats, she notices how Mark and Stephanie sit on the opposite side of the table from her, how Brian chooses the seat furthest away, despite arriving early enough to sit anywhere, how the casual pre-meeting conversation that was flowing naturally stops abruptly when she enters the room, replaced by forced politeness and rigid professionalism. The meeting proceeds according to agenda. Everyone contributes appropriately. Jennifer's ideas are acknowledged with neutral nods and brief comments that technically constitute engagement, but lack any genuine enthusiasm or building upon her suggestions. She proposes a new approach to user testing that could save the company significant time and money, explains the methodology clearly with supporting data, and the response is a polite acknowledgement from her manager, followed by an immediate pivot to the next agenda item without discussion or questions. Later, when Brian suggests something far less innovative, just a minor tweak to an existing process, the room comes alive with people building on his idea, offering refinements, expressing excitement about implementation, and Jennifer watches this differential response with a sinking feeling that she's been trying to deny for weeks. The meeting concludes with assignments distributed, Jennifer receiving tasks that are technically within her role, but somehow always peripheral, important enough to require a director-level person, but never central enough to give her real influence over strategic decisions. She notices that the truly critical projects are being quietly steered toward others, that when leadership discusses the company's future direction, her name rarely comes up except in contexts that feel obligatory, boxes being checked rather than genuine inclusion. After the meeting, people disperse quickly, conversations fragmenting into pairs and small groups that drift toward offices and cubicles, and Jennifer finds herself walking back to her office alone, despite having attempted to join several of these informal clusters, only to have them dissolve or shift away with mumbled excuses about urgent tasks needing attention. She sits at her desk and tries to analyze the situation rationally, to separate legitimate feedback about her performance from her own insecurities and possible paranoia. Her reviews have been positive. Her deliverables consistently meet or exceed expectations. She has not made any major mistakes or created obvious conflicts, yet she cannot shake the feeling that she is being systematically excluded from the real center of power and decision-making within the organization. She thinks about Machiavelli, whom she studied briefly in college, and his insights about political dynamics and the often invisible ways that power operates, how people in organizations rarely express their true feelings directly, but instead use subtle mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion to communicate favor or disfavor, how understanding these unspoken signals is essential to navigating complex social hierarchies. Jennifer starts paying closer attention to the patterns, documenting them not out of paranoia, but out of a need to understand whether her perceptions reflect reality or her own anxieties. She notices that emails she sends often receive delayed responses compared to others, that when she is copied on message threads, she is frequently moved to BCC on subsequent replies, technically still included, but rendered invisible and unable to participate in ongoing discussions. She observes that when she speaks in meetings, there is a quality of listening that differs from how people listen to others, a politeness that actually signals disengagement, people maintaining eye contact, but with expressions that suggest they are waiting for her to finish rather than actually processing what she is saying. She sees how social invitations to lunch or after-work drinks somehow never quite include her, how when she suggests team activities, There is lukewarm response and logistical obstacles that prevent plans from materializing, while similar suggestions from others generate immediate enthusiasm and successful execution. The evidence accumulates like water droplets forming a puddle, each individual instance deniable as coincidence or misinterpretation, but the overall pattern undeniable. She has fallen into what Machiavelli would have recognized immediately, a situation where formal authority and actual power have diverged, where her title and position give her no real influence because the people she needs to work with have collectively decided through processes they themselves might not even be conscious of that they do not want her to succeed. The most insidious aspect is that this rejection operates through omission rather than commission, through what is not said and not done rather than through direct confrontation or explicit opposition. No one tells her she is disliked or unwelcome. Everyone maintains surface-level professionalism and courtesy, but she is being slowly strangled by the absence of genuine support, collaboration, and inclusion that would be necessary for her to actually accomplish the transformative work she was hired to do. Jennifer decides she needs to understand the source of this invisible resistance, to identify what she did or failed to do that triggered this collective coldness. She schedules one-on-one meetings with several colleagues under the pretext of building stronger working relationships, and through careful questioning and active listening, she begins to piece together the underlying dynamics. She discovers that her predecessor in the Director of Product Innovation role had been extremely popular, a company veteran of 15 years who had been forced into early retirement due to health issues, and that many people on the team had expected an internal promotion for Sarah Chen, the senior manager who had been acting director for 6 months before Jennifer was hired from outside. Sarah had not applied for the permanent position, feeling she was not ready, but the team had hoped she would be developed and promoted, and Jennifer's arrival from outside the company, with her Ivy League credentials and Silicon Valley experience, had been received as a rejection of everything Sarah and the team had built, an implicit statement by leadership that their work and capabilities were insufficient. This discovery provides context, but does not fully explain the intensity of the exclusion Jennifer experiences, and as she continues her quiet investigation, she uncovers additional layers. Her management style, which had been successful at her previous company, a fast-moving startup where rapid iteration and direct feedback were valued, comes across as abrasive and dismissive in this more established organization, with its slower pace and emphasis on consensus building. Several people mention in carefully diplomatic language that they find her approach too aggressive, that she seems to question established processes without fully understanding the reasons they exist, that she pushes for changes without adequate consultation with the people who will be affected. Jennifer recognizes that there is truth in this feedback, that she had assumed the cultural norms of her previous workplace would transfer, that her confidence in her own methods had blinded her to the need to adapt to a different organizational culture and build trust before proposing significant changes. But even accounting for these factors, Jennifer senses something more fundamental at work, a dynamic that Machiavelli would have understood intimately, the way established groups resist outsiders, not just because of what outsiders do, but because of what they represent, threats to existing power structures and comfortable patterns. She realizes that regardless of how carefully she might have navigated the cultural differences, regardless of how much respect she might have shown for legacy systems and people, she would still have faced resistance simply by virtue of being the external hire in a role that people felt should have been filled internally. Her very presence is a reminder that leadership does not fully trust the existing team to drive innovation, that fresh perspectives were deemed necessary, and this implicit vote of no confidence in the status quo generates defensive reactions that get projected onto her personally, even though she is just the messenger of leadership's broader strategic concerns. The question becomes what to do with this understanding, how to respond to a situation where she is formally empowered but informally marginalized, where her actual ability to effect change is being nullified by subtle non-cooperation that never crosses the line into insubordination or grounds for disciplinary action. Jennifer considers several options, each with its own risks and potential outcomes. She could go to her manager or to human resources and report the pattern of exclusion, But she knows that without explicit discriminatory behavior or policy violations, her complaints would sound like interpersonal conflicts or inability to build relationships, reflecting poorly on her leadership capabilities rather than on those excluding her. She could try harder to win people over, to be more accommodating and patient, to slowly build trust through consistent performance and demonstrated respect for the team, but this strategy requires time she may not have and assumes that goodwill and competence can overcome organizational politics, an assumption Machiavelli would have considered dangerously naive. She could escalate her ideas and proposals directly to senior leadership, leveraging her formal authority and their initial enthusiasm for her hire to push through changes despite middle management resistance. But this would only deepen the resentment and create open conflict rather than the current Cold War, potentially destroying any remaining possibility of building genuine working relationships. Or she could accept that this position is untenable and begin looking for other opportunities, cutting her losses before the situation deteriorates further and potentially damages her reputation or confidence. But this feels like admitting defeat and allows those who never wanted her there in the first place to win by attrition. Each option reflects a different theory about how power and organizational politics work, different assumptions about whether formal authority or informal relationships ultimately determine success, different judgments about how much personal cost is worth paying to try to succeed in a hostile environment. Jennifer thinks about what Machiavelli would advise and realizes that his answer would depend on a careful assessment of the actual power dynamics rather than wishful thinking about what should work. Machiavelli understood that being right is not enough, that having formal authority is not enough, that even superior competence and good intentions are not enough if you lack the actual support and cooperation of the people whose efforts you need to accomplish your goals. He would ask her to assess coldly and honestly whether she has any realistic path to gaining that support, whether there are allies she can cultivate, whether there are wins she can deliver that would shift perceptions, whether time is on her side or against her. He would warn her against the temptation to believe that simply working harder or being more skilled will overcome determined opposition, that organizations are fundamentally political entities where perception and relationships often matter more than objective merit, where being isolated and excluded can become a self-fulfilling prophecy as others distance themselves from someone perceived to be losing favor. Jennifer starts mapping the political landscape more systematically, identifying who has actual influence regardless of formal title, who is connected to whom, where the real decision-making happens versus the theater of official meetings and processes. She discovers that Brian, who holds a manager title 2 levels below her, actually has enormous informal authority because he has been with the company for 12 years and has personal relationships with multiple executives, having worked closely with them when they were at lower levels. She learns that the Friday afternoon gathering at a bar near the office, which she had dismissed as optional socializing irrelevant to professional success, is actually where significant decisions get made and alliances are formed, where the real work of building consensus happens in ways that make Monday's formal meetings merely ratifications of conclusions already reached. She identifies Sarah Chen not as a rival, but as a potential key ally, someone who has influence with the team and could validate Jennifer's ideas if convinced that they serve the team's interests rather than threatening them. Armed with this deeper understanding, Jennifer develops a new strategy that Machiavelli would recognize as more sophisticated than her initial approach. Instead of pushing her own agenda, she starts by supporting other people's projects, offering her expertise and resources to help them succeed, building goodwill through demonstrated value rather than through attempts at personal charm or political maneuvering. She seeks out Sarah Chen for an honest conversation, acknowledging the awkwardness of the situation, expressing genuine respect for what Sarah has built, and proposing that they work together with Sarah, taking lead on implementation, while Jennifer provides strategic support and uses her relationships with senior leadership to secure resources and remove obstacles. This approach requires Jennifer to accept less visible credit and slower pace than she had hoped for, but it offers a path toward actually accomplishing the substantive work she cares about, rather than fighting endless battles over territory and recognition. The shift in Jennifer's approach produces gradual changes in how others respond to her, not dramatic or immediate, but perceptible over weeks and months. People become slightly less guarded in her presence, slightly more willing to include her in informal exchanges, slightly more responsive to her emails and ideas. She learns to read the subtle signals that indicate when to push and when to hold back, when an idea has potential support and when it will generate resistance regardless of its merits, how to frame proposals in language that connects to existing values and priorities rather than emphasizing their novelty and departure from tradition. She discovers that many of the signs she had interpreted as personal dislike were actually fear and insecurity. People worried that change would devalue their expertise or threaten their positions, and that addressing these fears directly, acknowledging them as legitimate rather than dismissing them as resistance to progress, opened space for more constructive dialogue. But Jennifer also recognizes that some resistance is indeed personal and political, rather than substantive, that some people simply do not want to see her succeed, because her success would validate leadership's decision to hire externally and implicitly criticize the status quo that these people have invested in defending. With these individuals, she learns to work around rather than through them, to find paths that do not require their active cooperation, to accept that not every relationship can be repaired, and that sometimes the most strategic choice is to limit interaction and minimize their ability to obstruct while focusing energy on relationships with more potential. This is one of Machiavelli's most important lessons, that resources are finite and should be invested where they can generate returns, that attempting to win over determined opponents often wastes energy better spent on consolidating support among those who are neutral or potentially friendly. The experience teaches Jennifer about the immense importance of reading unspoken communication, of understanding that in organizational life as in politics, what people do not say is often more revealing than what they do say, that the absence of positive signals is itself a signal that demands attention and interpretation. She learns to distinguish between different types of silence and neutrality, between the silence that indicates consideration and reflection versus the silence that indicates discomfort and disagreement, between neutrality that is genuine openness to persuasion versus neutrality that is polite mask for opposition. She develops a sensitivity to body language and micro-expressions, to the timing and tone of responses, to patterns of who talks to whom and who avoids whom, to all the subtle indicators that reveal the hidden structure of influence and affiliation that determines how organizations actually function, beneath their formal hierarchies and stated procedures. Jennifer also learns about her own role in the dynamics she had initially experienced as victimization, recognizing that while she had done nothing overtly wrong, she had also failed to do many things that might have smoothed her entry into a new organizational culture. She had not invested adequately in building relationships before pushing for changes, had not done sufficient homework on the history and context of existing practices before suggesting alternatives, had not shown enough curiosity about why things were done certain ways before proposing that they be done differently. Her confidence in her own expertise and experience, while justified in abstract terms, had manifested as arrogance in practical terms, as insufficient respect for local knowledge and accumulated wisdom. This realization is humbling but also empowering, because it means she has more agency than a pure victimization narrative would suggest, that by changing her own behavior and approach, she can influence how others respond to her, rather than being helplessly subject to their prejudices and politics. The deeper lesson that emerges from Jennifer's experience is something that Machiavelli understood profoundly, that human beings are social animals whose survival and success depend on membership in groups and acceptance by others, that we are exquisitely sensitive to signals of inclusion and exclusion, because historically being cast out from the tribe meant death, and that this sensitivity operates largely below the level of conscious awareness through feelings and intuitions that we often struggle to articulate or justify rationally. The signs that someone does not like you or want you in their group are rarely explicit, rarely take the form of direct confrontation or stated rejection, precisely because such directness would require justification and create opportunities for appeal or intervention by authorities. Instead, rejection operates through the withdrawal of small courtesies and forms of support, through patterns of omission and exclusion that are individually deniable but collectively unmistakable to anyone paying attention, through mechanisms that create plausible deniability for those doing the excluding, while being perfectly clear to the person being excluded. These mechanisms include being consistently left off in formal communication channels while remaining on formal ones, being included in meetings but having contributions ignored or minimized, having ideas dismissed when you propose them but embraced when others propose identical ideas, receiving responses that are technically polite but lack warmth or genuine engagement, finding that collaboration and assistance that flows freely to others requires repeated requests and pushing when you need it, noticing that social invitations and informal gatherings somehow never include you, observing that people find reasons to end conversations when you join them or to leave spaces shortly after you arrive, discovering that information that everyone else seems to know somehow did not reach you, and experiencing a general quality of interaction that maintains surface-level correctness while withholding the genuine connection and support that would make actual collaboration and success possible. Jennifer learns to recognize these signs not as invitations to self-doubt or paranoia, but as information, data about her environment that requires strategic response rather than emotional reaction. Machiavelli would approve of this approach, of treating organizational dynamics as a domain requiring the same careful observation and strategic thinking that generals apply to military campaigns or politicians apply to electoral contests, neither assuming good faith nor descending into cynicism, but rather assessing situations realistically and adapting tactics to circumstances. The person who cannot read these subtle signals, who mistakes formal politeness for genuine acceptance, who assumes that competence and good intentions will automatically generate support, is like a navigator who cannot read the weather, likely to find themselves in storms they never saw coming, wondering why outcomes do not match expectations when the signs were always there for anyone paying attention. As Jennifer becomes more skilled at reading and responding to these dynamics, she finds that her effectiveness increases dramatically, not because her technical skills have improved, but because she has learned to navigate the human and political dimensions that determine whether technical skills can actually be applied productively. She still faces resistance and skepticism, still encounters people who would prefer she had never been hired, but she has learned to work with and around these realities rather than being paralyzed or defeated by them. She has built a coalition of support, not universal but sufficient. People who believe in her vision and trust her enough to advocate for her ideas and include her in the informal networks where real work gets done. She has learned to pick her battles, to recognize which hills are worth dying on and which are better conceded in service of larger strategic objectives. The transformation is not complete or total. Organizational politics remains challenging and sometimes frustrating, but Jennifer has developed the literacy in unspoken communication that Machiavelli would have considered essential to effective leadership. The ability to see beneath surface appearances to the actual structure of power and affiliation, to recognize when formal agreement masks hidden opposition, to distinguish genuine allies from fair-weather friends who will support you only when it is convenient and costless. She has learned that in organizational life, as in politics, your enemies will rarely announce themselves, your obstacles will rarely be openly stated, your path will rarely be explicitly blocked. Instead, you will face the death of 1,000 small exclusions and withholdings, the slow starvation of resources and support that looks like nothing dramatic, but adds up to effective neutralization of your ability to accomplish your goals. The wisdom Jennifer gains is not cynical or pessimistic, though it might initially seem so to someone who had previously believed that organizations are pure meritocracies where good work automatically gets recognized and rewarded. Rather, it is realistic, acknowledging that human beings are complex creatures who operate from mixed motives, that organizations are political systems where competing interests and perspectives must somehow be negotiated, that power and influence flow through both formal and informal channels, and that success requires navigating both. Understanding the signs that people do not like you, or do not want you to succeed, is not about becoming paranoid or defensive, but about gathering accurate information about your environment so you can make intelligent, strategic choices about where to invest your energy, who to trust and how much, which battles to fight and which to avoid, when to persist, and when to cut losses and redirect toward more promising opportunities. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. But in organizational contexts, a more useful formulation might be that it is better to be respected and useful than to be universally liked, that trying to win over determined opponents often wastes resources better spent on cultivating allies and delivering value, that being aware of who opposes you and why is more important than being liked by everyone. Jennifer's experience validates this wisdom, showing that success does not require universal popularity or the absence of opposition, but rather requires accurate assessment of political realities and strategic deployment of limited resources toward achievable goals. Those who cannot or will not read the subtle signs of exclusion and opposition, who insist on taking everyone at face value and believing that stated policies reflect actual practices, will find themselves repeatedly blindsided and confused, unable to understand why their talents and efforts do not generate expected results, while those who develop this literacy will be able to navigate complexity with greater effectiveness and ultimately greater satisfaction.